All right, so chapter 4, the respiratory system, about breathing. In just that short space of time, a lot happens. We know about oxygen going in and carbon dioxide coming out, but that oxygen and carbon dioxide, that's destined for our cells, not necessarily our lungs. So that's not where that change is actually happening. We breathe in so that we can get the oxygen to our cells. They are producing CO2 at the same time that comes back through our blood, and then we can breathe that out. So that's a pretty big deal. So we'll set the stage there for a later chapter where we'll talk about how do we make the CO2 and why do we need oxygen. So it kind of should make some sense when you breathe in. There's going to be dust and bacteria and other stuff that you don't want just going straight into your bloodstream. There needs to be a barrier, and that's where membranes come in. Membranes are kind of what this class is all about, and we start our journey here with the membranes surrounding each of those little tiny air sacs, the alveoli, at the end of the bronchioles and all those little tubules. That's where the air ends, and there's blood around that and little capillaries, and the exchange that takes place, there's a barrier of a very thin membrane. But that membrane is important so that the bad stuff doesn't get in, and we only let the things through that barrier that we want. Oxygen and carbon dioxide gets a free pass. Well, let's start by understanding the chemistry of this. Why does this work? Why can carbon dioxide and oxygen come and go as they please, and other things can't? Well, we need to understand diffusion, but also the chemical nature of lipids. They're always the one that's different than all the other chemicals. We've talked about DNA before. Now we get into lipids, and carbohydrates and proteins will come later. So we'll talk a little bit about those and how they interact with other chemicals. Let's start by expanding on our idea of covalent and know that there are two different types of covalent bonds. These guys over here are non-polar versus these guys over here, like water, are polar. And this is because between the carbons here, they share electrons equally. Same with the carbon and hydrogen. But anytime you have oxygen or nitrogen involved, either of those are going to create unequal electron sharing, where there's more time spent by electrons up here, and so the oxygen ends up partially negative and the hydrogen partially positive. There's none of that over here in the non-polar world, and this is the world of things like lipids, fats, oils, things like that. The only other ones you might run into is really bad solvents like gasoline. So we don't have much of that in our body. Most of the rest of the stuff is over here, like water. So carbohydrates are polar. Proteins, most of them are polar. DNA and other nucleic acids are polar. So most of that stuff dissolves well in water, which you'd expect. But lipids, very importantly, do not get along and create a barrier to water and all these others. So there's kind of this dividing line here between the non-polar world of the lipids and the polar world of the rest of it, including these ionic compounds like salts, which when they go into water break up into electrolytes. So we're back down here with the biomolecules again. We've talked about nucleic acids. Carbohydrates and proteins will come up in the next chapter, but here we talk about lipids, which are things like oils and fats and some others. So their base structure here is the fatty acid. It doesn't work quite like the other ones that have these repeating chains, as we'll see a little bit later. I've drawn a skeletal structure of this where I've left out the carbons and hydrogens, so if that doesn't make sense, make sure you review that part. What we can see is that this is mostly carbon and hydrogen. So all lipids are really rich in carbon and hydrogen. they have a little bit of oxygen, so I'm going to put it in parentheses. Probably most important if we think about the functions, and for lipids, it gets kind of interesting because there are different types. So let's start with the most common, the triglyceride. And I'm just going to summarize the functions here. Probably most important is energy storage. So the fat underneath our skin and other areas stores a lot of energy very efficiently. It also helps to cushion us when we get bumped. The fat provides an excellent cushion. It's also insulation. So keeps all that warmth in. Another really important type is the phospholipid, and this forms cell membranes. So this is going to become a major player in this class. It's the phospholipids as the base of our cell membranes. There's one other group, the steroid group, or sterols, sometimes it's called. They have a couple of different functions. A lot of them are hormones, like estrogen and testosterone. Your job is to keep the membrane just the right level of fluid. Not too solid, not too loose and fluid, just right. That's one of the roles of cholesterol, which is a type of steroid. All right, not quite done with chemistry yet. We need to talk about pH still. pH is a really important concept in all of biology, from the cells to the blood to all the other fluids in the body. I needed to put it in somewhere, and why not here? We need to talk about it early, and breathing in and out actually helps regulate the pH of our blood because it's getting rid of carbon dioxide, which could build up and become acidic. So let's just look at the basics of the pH scale. pH. So this is the thing that's regulated by breathing in and out. Our kind of happy place is right here around 7. That's neutral. Anything this side is acidic, and this side is basic or alkaline. pH scale is a log scale, which means it's every jump in numbers is 10 times the previous one. So if you go from 7 to 9, you think that's a jump of 2, but it's not. It's a jump of 100. There's 2 zeros. And if we were to go from 7 to 10, then that would be a jump of 3 zeros, so 1,000 times. 1,000 times what? 1,000 times of the hydrogen ion concentration. That is what pH is measuring. So over here on the acidic side, there's lots of hydrogen ions. And over here on the basic end, there's very, very few. There's lots of hydroxide ions in solution. So if we take away a lot of the, you just pack as many in there as possible, take away as many hydrogen ions as possible and put in hydroxides, then we have a really basic solution. That's one way of looking at it. There are other ways, just to be clear. So hydroxide really far outnumbers hydrogen ions as we get more and more basic. And then in the neutral category, the hydroxide ions basically equal the hydrogen ions. Again, nice happy place. There we are. We'll come back and expand on this quite a bit more in the future. Here we are in the cell, and we kind of need a way of talking conveniently about inside and outside. So here we have the extracellular fluid, or ECF, versus the intracellular fluid. So now we can talk about ECF and ICF, and you'll know what it is we're talking about, because most of this class concerns what goes in and out of a cell. I'll try to avoid those technical terms, or at least the acronyms, but it is a useful way to go. Our concern is down here at the bottom. So we've talked about the lungs, and they bring oxygen into the blood, and carbon dioxide leaves the blood into those air spaces in the lungs so we can breathe it out. But all that is done so that the oxygen can come into the cell, specifically to the mitochondria. Those mitochondria, meanwhile, are producing carbon dioxide, which then leaves. Now, since both of these are small nonpolar molecules, they can pass right through this cell membrane, which we should label, by the way. So that cell membrane, different than a wall. The cell membrane is selectively permeable. Pretty important concept. So it does not select oxygen or CO2. They come right in. So we call that process simple diffusion. Now, what determines whether they go in or out? Why does CO2 go out and oxygen comes in? That has to do with the diffusion part, which is things move from a high concentration to a low. So oxygen has a higher concentration outside and a lower concentration inside, so oxygen moves in. CO2, since it's being produced in here, has a high concentration inside the cell and a lower concentration outside, so it moves out. Other things that might move in this way would be things like lipids, like some of the steroids and fatty acids. They can come in and out of the membrane as they please, no problem. Finally, let's look at all this in the physiology page in terms of how the respiratory system interacts with the rest of the body. And a lot of this has to do with flow down gradients. We need to create a gradient using the muscle in our diaphragm, which goes up and down, in order to create pressure. High pressure when it goes up, it relaxes, and low pressure when it contracts and goes down, so that the air will move in and out. Because if we just waited for diffusion alone and just sit there with our mouths open, life just wouldn't be possible. We need that muscular movement to create gradients in order to make the air come in and out quickly enough to support the fast life that our cells live. All right, last stop here at physiology, looking at the lungs right here, and they're in the thoracic cavity, which is surrounded by ribs, so it's actually fairly rigid. The moving part is this right here. This muscle forms a dome below your ribs, the diaphragm. So when it relaxes and moves up, that creates high pressure. And so there's high pressure in the thoracic cavity. The air outside remains the same pressure. And so what that does is it drives air out. This is a flow down gradient. We saw this with simple diffusion. Things move from high to low. In this case, it's moving from high pressure to low pressure. We created high pressure inside the body, so it moves out. When we go to breathe in, that diaphragm contracts and pulls down, creating inside the thoracic cavity a low pressure or suction. And so that pulls the air back into the lungs. And so by using muscles, we breathe in and we breathe out. Now, all the purpose of that is when we breathe in, we have oxygen. That the air that we breathe in is rich in oxygen, so it's going to move from a high concentration in the air spaces into the bloodstream. And so oxygen goes in, whereas the blood that's coming into the lungs is high concentration of carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide is going to leave because this fresh air you just breathed in is low in carbon dioxide. So it goes into those air spaces and gets breathed out. Again, powered by the diaphragm in and out. But all this is the result of what's going on at the cells. So these cells, specifically the mitochondria, are producing carbon dioxide, which diffuses into the blood, whereas the blood coming in has a high concentration of oxygen. and that diffuses into the cells, just like we talked about on the other diagram. Well, there you have it. That's the respiratory system.